In the book Just Courage, Haugen said, there are two things that are always the will of God, and also often dangerous. First of all, telling the truth, and secondly, loving needy people. Those two things are always the will of God, and they're often dangerous. Because loving isn't always easy. There are many reasons that we're afraid to get involved in fighting injustices. What will others think or say about us? It's also an issue that it may cost us. It may cost us our time. It may cost us our resources. In some cases, I read through the cards of people from the first service, and someone identified one of the injustices was that they were being asked to do things that were illegal in their job. Sometimes standing up for injustices might even mean that we lose our job in the process. Standing up for injustices are not easy. I know of a Methodist pastor in the South who spoke against segregation and in favor of civil rights back in the 50s and 60s. And as he stood up for what was right, as he proclaimed the truth, he also faced so much danger that he and his family had to relocate. And he's been a pastor in the former North Indiana Conference for many years because he spoke out against the injustices that were happening in the South. And he had to flee because of the dangers that speaking the truth brought in his life. When we try to do something about injustices, we're often fearful because we're afraid that, who am I? I don't have any power. I don't have any influence. I really can't do anything about making this situation right. But I'm reminded of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul identifies that he has some sort of an infirmity. He describes it as a thorn in the flesh. We don't know exactly what it is that Paul is dealing with, but he said he prayed that God would relieve this thorn in his flesh 3 times, and 3 times God refused. Listen to what Paul writes, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning with verse 7. To keep me from being conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given to me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why for Christ's sake I delight in weakness and insults and hardship and persecution and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. As Paul was facing a struggle in his life, he didn't get the answer from God that he wanted. He didn't have this thorn in the flesh removed from him, but what God did do was he spoke to him and said, my grace is sufficient. What God says to Paul is that when facing struggles, when life doesn't work out as you would had hoped for or would like it to have worked out, God's grace is sufficient. God's grace is sufficient to see you through. We all know people who seem to enjoy wallowing in misery. They're always complaining about their circumstances. They're often complaining about something that is out of their control. If you find yourself in a situation in which you feel it's out of control, God's message to you is my grace is sufficient. The second thing Paul hears from God in this process is that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. When we have life by the tail, we often act as if we don't need God. Oh, now that may be a little extreme. And in our minds we'd say, of course, I know I always need God. But really our actions, when when life is going well, when we've got life by the tail, we can handle things just fine, thank you very much. And we act as if we really don't need God. But maybe what Paul is saying is that when his life is out of control, when he can't handle his thorn in the flesh, when there's nothing that he can do about it, when life is out of his control, not only does God say, my grace is sufficient, but God also says that my power is made perfect in your weakness. Now, let me go back to the matter of injustice. One of the reasons we're hesitant or afraid to get involved in matters of justice is because it's too hard. We often feel helpless and too weak to do anything. We don't like feeling vulnerable. But it's when we feel weak, when we realize I really can't do anything about this on my own, that we then become a conduit through which God's power, God's strength can be manifest or made known. Once again in Haugen's book, Just Courage, he says, Jesus is sympathetic with our fears, but irritated by the fact that we make excuses. Jesus is sympathetic with our fears, but he's irritated with the fact that we make excuses. If God can be trusted, then he will help us to address injustices. If God can't be trusted, then for us to get involved in matters of injustice is just plain stupid. But the thing is, with our minds we say God can be trusted, but with our actions we often say it's all up to me. But in our weakness, when we feel that we are helpless to really make an impact, that's when God's power, that's when God's strength can flow through us. Well, let me turn the corner here and begin to deal with some application. First of all, when we're dealing with something in our weakness, our first and greatest ally should be prayer. When we see injustices that are too big for us to handle, our first response to those injustices should be prayer. Seeking God's wisdom of how it is that we might be able to respond to those injustices. I told you earlier about the author of the book Just Courage and the organization that he leads, International Justice Mission. You know, they're seeking to free people from slavery. They're doing things around the world that finds themselves in harm's way. And as he writes, he says that they recognize there's no way that they can care for these injustices on their own. And so a part of the routine with their organization is that every morning at 8 o'clock, each member that works on the IJM team spends time in prayer. And then at 11 o'clock every day, they stop whatever they're doing and they come together corporately to pray for one another, the dangers that they're facing, the inadequacies that they are facing in order to address the injustice. You know, they make the injustices and their inadequacy a matter of prayer so that in their weakness, God's power might show forth. It's easy for us to feel overwhelmed and helpless when confronting matters of injustice. But our first step and regular steps should be that of committing our endeavors to God in prayer. You know, I want to encourage you to fill out the cards this morning. If you haven't done so already, if you can jot down some idea of injustices that you see or injustices you're responding to. If you don't have time to do it before the end of the service, give it to me on the way out, or call the office this week and leave a message on the answering machine. We're wanting to get as many different ideas for us to think about and consider.